Hello students. Whenever we want to talk about medieval political thought in India, one name comes to the forefront, that of ZLAUDDIN Barani. He will in a sense remind you of Machiavelli and the way he gave his advice to the prince. ZLAUDDIN Barani was a renowned historian and a reputed scholar. And he was himself convinced that if the sultans of the Delhi Sultanate took his advice seriously, they would stand to benefit and prosper. But if they did not, they would be imperiled. As we get exposed to the views of Barani, you will see that he had his shortcomings. He was, in a sense, a religious fanatic who had extreme views about Islam. But all that apart, there is no denying that his FATWA-I-JAHANDARI is a monumental work. And when we take a look into this wonderful work, we come across very insightful projections about the political underpinnings of the Delhi Sultanate in medieval India. So let us begin by taking a look at Barani's childhood. ZLAUDDIN Barani was born at Bulandshahr around 1258 AD. He was the first Indo-Persian historian to be born and brought up in India. Not much is known about Barani's early education, but he himself tells us that he was exposed to numerous scholars and men of letters. He in fact recounts his exposure to about 46 reputed teachers. And the more he came close to them and he got exposed to their ideas, his own mental and intellectual horizons widened. He had cordial terms with Amir Khusrau. I'm sure you've heard about him. He was one of the most famous poets of medieval and modern India. He passed his youth in luxury and pomp, living a gorgeous life akin to that of the nobles of his time. But glorious beginnings do not always meet with glorious ends. Barani was faithful and a favorite courtier of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. However, with the death of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, all that glory and pomp that was part and parcel of Barani's life got eclipsed, and gloom and misery descended. He lost the royal patronage and all his properties and assets were confiscated. He became a pauper overnight. Towards the end of his life, you find the dying embers of a disenchanted enthusiasm as he was disowned by friends, neglected by relatives, and despised by his enemies. He died a heartbroken man. But let us look at Barani, the glorious historian that he was. He is reputed for his writings on the history and the politics of the Delhi Sultanate. A very important work, Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, written by Barani, is a dependable source of history from the later times of Balban to the early years of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, to whom this book is actually dedicated. Along with the historical accounts of the period, Barani discusses the Muslim political problems, including implementation of Islamic laws in the newly established Muslim state of India. Using mainly hearsay evidence and his personal experiences at court, Barani in 1357 wrote the Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, which is basically the history of Firoz Shah, a didactic work setting down the duties of the Indian Sultan towards Islam. In this book, FATWA-I-JAHANDARI, which is basically rulings on temporal government, which was influenced to a large extent by Sufi mysticism, he expounded a religious philosophy of history that viewed the events in the lives of great men as manifestations of divine providence. According to Barani, the Delhi Sultans from Balban right up to Firoz Shah Tughlaq, followed his guidelines for the good Islamic ruler, and they prospered, while those who deviated from those precepts tended to fail. Barani's Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi is mainly a book on history and not a political treatise like his monumental work, the Fatwa-I-JAHANDARI, in which he advised the sultans and the kings, through the mouth of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, his ideal ruler, as to how an effective system of government could be established by implementing the Islamic Shariat. What is the basic theme of the Fatwa-I-Jahandari? It appears to be a kind of supplement. The work that he began with Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi gets extended into the Fatwa-I-Jahandari. What Barani merely hinted in the Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi, he actually embellished and elaborated in the Fatwa-I-Jahandari. The basic objective before Barani is very clear, that is implementation of the Islamic Shariat. He has raised a number of issues in this respect, of which some can be criticized and some can be praised. For him, Islamic Shariat has no dogmatic value. It has to achieve an ideal which, according to him, is the dominance of good values over those of evil forces. In his interpretation of Islamic political philosophy, he pointed out that evil forces cannot be completely obliterated from any society. But he desires that the king should evolve a system of administration, army, intelligence, and judiciary, that persons of high integrity and character should act as vehicles of the good forces in their fight against the evil ones. For him, the tussle between the right and the wrong, between the good and the evil, is something that will continue right up to Judgment Day. The fatwa highlights the good qualities and the virtues that a monarch ought to possess in his battle against evil. It begins with an account of the creation of the world and the prophets and their teachings. The king is not allowed by Barani to adopt evils and vices, although he may be surrounded by many an evil act. His character should generally be molded according to the ideals of Islam. He is requested to be honest, straightforward, and far-sighted. A person with bad character is simply unacceptable to Barani, because if the king is of bad character, he will be considered more a representative of Satan, who will lose out in his fight against evil. In addition to having a good character, the king is suggested to act in conduct of his responsibilities with certain methods, certain policies which Barani outlines. The king is requested to accept Islamic Shariat from the core of his heart and also try to evolve his policies for peace and war in consultation with his administrators, advisors, and commanders. So what is the basic question that Barani raises? Even the rules and the regulations regarding his officers and ministers should be evolved according to Barani after due consultation with relevant men of knowledge and experience. The king should never become complacent. According to Barani, kingship should be oriented to act within the bounds of Islamic Sharia for the economic prosperity of the people. That is always the focal point, the welfare of the people. And that is what he emphasizes in the fatwa. The king must take particular care to provide basic essentials of life to the people at the lowest possible rates. You can easily see how much he is committed to the installation of a welfare state in medieval India. Like a practical philosopher, Barani lays down guidelines which would serve as a basis for the king to evolve various institutions like the judiciary and the army, because without these supportive institutions, he will not be able to accomplish his mission of establishing a welfare state for the people. So what does the administration that Barani flags looks like? He describes the principles of administration and ideals of government, and these are illustrated by instances drawn from the history of Iran as well as other Muslim countries. In all this, Barani claimed to have gone well ahead of his contemporaries as well as earlier writers. He himself observes, and I quote, "Old writers had many works on administration, but the way in which I have explained the principles and ordinance of administration for the guidance of kings, ministers, maliks, and amirs has not been done so far by any writer." Unquote. Indeed, the detail that Barani has provided about the Sultan, about the courts, and how they functioned, how policies were framed, alongside descriptions of life in general in the Delhi Sultanate, offers an incredible insight into the socio-economic milieu of the Delhi Sultanate around the 14th century. And that is why the fatwa is such an important source of our understanding about the history of the Delhi Sultanate. What about appointing ministers and administrators? The king is suggested to appoint good persons as commanders, administrators, and various office bearers of the Delhi Sultanate. Due to this importance of their functions, the king should be careful in selecting and appointing his officers of the state. Sincere, God-fearing, and devoted persons should be appointed. Persons of low birth, bad habits, irreligion, and short-sightedness should not be inducted. If a ruler or king bestows his government in the hand of nobles of bad character, his downfall and destruction are almost inevitable. Moreover, Barani observes that when the king will face God on the day of judgment, he will be disappointed. But in the company of God-fearing and good souls appointed to perform the various responsibilities of the state, the king's rule would become secure and lasting. In this way, he will also not be ashamed of coming face to face with his creator. And the king, Barani was emphatic, should always lead by example. The king should endeavor to cultivate in himself all the features of godliness and godhood. His real purpose in establishing order and discipline in the state should be to establish truth in walks of life all around. His state should give Islamic Shariat and the Islamic Millat a high position of honor and respect. In doing so, it should also not be understood that falsehood and evils can be completely removed from society. Barani is no utopian. Evil forces remain in the society. This is because every creature has its opposite form. Against truth, there is falsehood. Against order, God has also created disorder. Against right, he has created wrong. Against goodness, there is evil. On the same lines, he has created day and night, light and darkness, earth and sky, faith and negation, monism and pluralism. But despite these alternatives that masquerade all around, the king should always be committed to good in his fight over evil. In this background, the purpose of promoting the cause of truthfulness is not to completely destroy the evil forces, because that would be impossible, perhaps utopian. Rather, the wisdom of God and values should be always observed and followed and emulated. The work of every good is known and distinguished because of existence of opposing forces and objects. The king or the sultan should rule in such a way that good forces are made to dominate over the evil forces. Thus, Islamic forces are to be honored against those of the un-Islamic ones. Students, I have already told you of the several shortcomings of Barani. One of them is his extreme views on religion. The ideal of kingship in the Delhi Sultanate was largely influenced by Islamic ideas whereby the rulers claimed to be representatives of God on earth. Barani recommends that a Muslim king should concentrate all his powers on holy wars and completely uproot all false creeds. He believed that a Muslim king should commit himself to the establishment of the supremacy of Islam in India and simultaneously annihilate the Brahmins. In fact, this sounds preposterous, but he said that a Muslim king ought to embrace a firm resolve to overpower, capture, enslave, and degrade every infidel. He is almost a fanatical protagonist of Islam. He advocated an all-out struggle against Hinduism. He writes in his old age, as he put together the fatwa, I quote, "The Muslim king will not be able to establish the honor of theism and the supremacy of Islam unless he strives with all his courage to overthrow infidelity and to slaughter its leaders, who are in India are the Brahmins. All the strength and power of the king and of the holy wars of Islam should be concentrated in holy campaigns and holy wars." And he also had extreme views about the Hindus. As Hindus had enjoyed the monopoly of trade and commerce, Barani did not hesitate to recommend that Hindu merchants and traders ought to be deprived of their wealth and assets. They could even be humiliated in society. Those like the Brahmins, who occupied the apex of the social hierarchy and enjoyed status and wealth, could even be robbed, and the wealth could be redistributed among the Muslims who were poor and poverty-stricken. So what is required according to Barani is a balance between mercy and punishment. Barani admits that Muslim kings were generally tolerant and the Hindus were prosperous. He prescribes that the kings should hear complaints. He reminds of the observation in the Quran that God is the forgiver of sin. A king with foresight and vision ought to embody in his rule such a balance between forgiveness and punishment. He should recognize the rights of old servants, slaves, select men of his kingdom, his relations and well-wishers. As long as this balance is maintained, he is sure to attain salvation in the next world as well. But what is also insightful about Barani, that he is conscious about the role that the Muslim king must facilitate for intellectuals and writers and scholars like him. It is necessary for the Muslim king to help and encourage the Muslim scholars and intellectuals at all costs so that the cause of righteousness is upheld. His administrators and commanders should also act on this principle. When knowledge of Islam spreads, the people will even forget to think of bad habits and faithlessness. So those who still maintain bad habits will be dishonored and discouraged. In this way, noble thoughts, virtual orientations, righteousness will all dominate over evil forces. And this will have a positive consequence. How? Simple-minded people, as a result of the spread of Islamic values, will feel encouraged to embrace noble thoughts and good habits. The rich people will be happy to spend more on the poor and to dish out charity and alms. Poverty will shrink and ultimately become non-existent. False and treacherous people will be discouraged. Forgery and adulteration will also disappear, as will thefts and robbery. An atmosphere of justice will prevail, and they will be generally fearful about the king. Thus, peace and order will prevail in the realm. And in all this, Barani hopes that the kingdom of God will emerge on earth. How? The powerful persons will not dare to commit any injustice against the weak people. Nobody will dare to be cruel to any person. Mosques, schools, colleges, universities will be filled with students who will have greater and greater thirst for knowledge. The children would be obedient to their parents. The servants will be found to be loyal to their masters, and people will generally honor their commitments, and they will genuinely act according to the laws of the Shariat. And that is how the kingdom of God will be created on earth. But Barani is also clear about appointment of officers of intelligence, because without these officers, the king's stability, the stability of the realm, cannot be ensured. Because Barani was conscious that the stability of the Sultanate could be jeopardized by acts of treachery and rebellion. If an Islamic king comes to know about signs of revolt or disturbance in any part of his empire, through his intelligence and information officers, he will be able to tackle them. The plan ought to be prepared in consultation with his advisors, commanders, and administrators. If the people come to know that the king's espionage system is robust, then they will fear to secretly meet with each other and plan anything against him. In this way, the king's rule will become more secure, and security of the kingdom is also uppermost in Barani's mind. Seeing this importance of the intelligence and information officers and sending ambassadors to different areas of the world, the king should be very careful, because a lot depends on their reports. Therefore, the king should be careful to appoint these officers. In appointing them, the king should be mindful that God has created different kinds of people with different qualities. The king should particularly watch over their activities of the trouble creators and try to check their activities by adopting various methods of warning and punishment. Such people should not be given a place of honor in the state. And he repeats that only people with good habits, sincerity, and good cause should be encouraged, patronized, and honored, so that goodness and prosperity develop in their name. So good government demands maintenance of an efficient and a disciplined army. The idea was not altogether alien to Indian civilization, where the king since ancient times was considered a repository of the power of Dando, or the right to coerce or punish. It has to be borne in mind that Barani's idea of force was based on the army and rooted in the military tactics rather than merely in the king's ability to inflict punishment. So what does he advise the king? 1. The king should constantly look after the interests and welfare of the workers. All requirements and provisions of the army should be adequately met, so that the soldiers are at the end of the day happy to deliver. If the commanders of such dedicated workers are kind-hearted, they must also be intelligent. And he should select commanders and dedicated nobles on the basis of their abilities. Regarding economic policy, the king also has to follow what was shown by Alauddin Khilji. He desires that the prices of commodities should be fixed by the state according to the cost of production. The king should be particularly careful on maintaining a low price structure. Barani is concerned with the welfare of the people. That comes out through and through in his economic advisory also. And during natural calamities, the king should reach out to the poor and make concessions by reducing taxes and advancing loans from the treasury. So the king is ultimately the linchpin of the realm, the fulcrum. And the salvation of the king depends upon the elevation of his heart, because merely external acts and policies are insufficient. Barani hoped that his book would be appreciated by wise men, and his elaborate suggestions on devising a strong state and a robust administrative system would not go in vain. Of course, I have told you that he had his shortcomings, his failing memory, his prejudices against the Hindus, his extreme views on religion, and his almost fanatical advocacy of Islam definitely are held against him. But all these shortcomings apart, the fact remains that the FATWA-I-JAHANDARI is a monumental work on the politics and the history of the Delhi Sultanate. And it has been rightly commented that no historian under conditions so distressing and at an age so advanced has produced a work so great. So the Fatwa-I-JAHANDARI remains a monumental piece of work and a gold mine when one wants to delve into the social and the political reality of the Delhi Sultanate, that is the state in medieval India.